The world-designated Gamma-7 was a mausoleum of forgotten ambition. Its sky, a permanent bruise of ochre and gray, wept a thin, acidic drizzle onto the carcass of a civilization that had reached for the stars and been slapped back into the mud. Our surveys showed the last reactor flicker had died over 2 centuries prior. The mission was straightforward: tactical assessment of post-technological collapse, mineral survey, exoarchaeological cataloging. Standard, somber work. We found the expected remnants: shattered ferroconcrete spires resembling broken teeth, silent factories overgrown with phosphorescent fungi, and the quiet, pervasive sadness of a species that had extinguished its own light. I was there with a 4-unit Mech team. I was the pilot of M77, a standard Gladius-class bipedal combat and engineering unit, 10 feet of titanium alloy, servo muscle bundles, and sensor suites. My call sign, stenciled in fading white on the chassis, was Kintsugi. A personal affectation. The philosophy of repair, of highlighting breaks with gold. It felt ironic here, amid irrevocable ruin. We were mapping a derelict transit hub when the perimeter sensors pinged. Not a radiation ghost or a falling masonry echo. A biological signature. Faint, warm, and small. The scanners triangulated the source, a collapsed service duct beneath a plaza adorned with the faded mosaics of the planet's lost inhabitants, their elongated faces and large eyes staring blankly at the decay. Probable native survivor, came the dispassionate voice of Dr. Ilara Vance, our xenobiologist, over the comms. Scans indicate severe malnutrition, juvenile. A remarkable anomaly. Extract for study, Kintsugi. Use non-lethal protocols. A part of me, the part that still piloted the Mech with a human heart and not just a neural link, recoiled at extract for study. But protocol was protocol. I guided M77 through the shattered plaza, the Mech's footfalls crunching on debris, a sound like grinding bones in the oppressive silence. The smell hit my external filters first: decay, damp, and, beneath it, the sharp, sour tang of a living thing in dire need. I activated the Mech's frontal lamps, cutting beams through the gloom of the duct. And there it was. The alien child was huddled against a corroded pipe, wrapped in rags that might have once been vibrant. It was bipedal, vaguely humanoid, with large, luminous eyes that dominated a gaunt, gray-skinned face. A pair of delicate, vestigial antennae drooped from its brow. It shivered violently, not from the cold, but from the sheer effort of sustaining a metabolism on empty. It did not scream at the sight of the giant metal warform looming over it. Its terror was a silent, absolute thing. It just stared, those huge eyes reflecting the Mech's harsh lights, pools of pure, exhausted despair. It was then that I noticed the small, 3-fingered hand clutching a piece of shattered ceramic, scraping futilely at a patch of the luminescent fungi. It brought a flake to its mouth, then gagged, a weak, pathetic sound that barely registered on my audio pickups but screamed through my soul. Protocol dictated immediate sedation and retrieval. My hand hovered over the control to deploy a mild tranquilizer dart. But I froze. I saw not a specimen, not an anomaly. I saw a kid. A starving kid, alone in the dark, at the end of everything. The disconnect between the immense power of the machine I inhabited and the profound vulnerability before me was an abyss. I was a god of metal and could offer no bread. The words of my grandfather, a man who had survived a different kind of wasteland, surfaced in my mind, not as a conscious thought but as a visceral, cellular truth: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. He hadn't meant it as a callous creed of strength over weakness. He meant the weakness of indifference. The fragility of a hardened heart. The vulnerability of a soul that chooses not to see, not to feel, not to act in the face of suffering because it is safer. To destroy that cowardly, pragmatic, weak self was to become invulnerable to the true destruction, the loss of one's own humanity. In that moment, my weak self was the pilot who followed protocol, who saw a data point. That self had to die. I overrode the non-lethal protocols. But not for aggression. I slowly, so slowly, lowered the 12-ton Mech into a crouch, its joints whining in protest. The child flinched, pressing further into the pipe. I retracted the Mech's right-hand weapon array, leaving the bare servo actuator. With a delicacy that took every ounce of my piloting skill, I reached not for the child, but for the wall beside it. I extended a single, articulated finger, tipped with a diamond-hard alloy used for cutting through bulkheads. And I began to write. The screech of metal on stone was awful, but I formed the symbols carefully, in the script of the Galactic Common, a language our linguists had deciphered from the planet's ruins. I wrote a sentence. Then, I did something unthinkable. I triggered the external vocalizer, my own voice, filtered through the Mech systems, echoing in the confined space. I promise to pay later, the metal giant boomed, each word a seismic event. The child stared at the gouged message, then, back at the faceless helmet of the Mech. Comprehension was impossible, but the tone of the careful, gravelly modulation I forced into the voice was universal. It was not a threat. It was an offer. A bizarre, impossible offer from a being of terrifying power. Reaching into a secondary compartment on the Mech's thigh, a tool storage bin, I retrieved my own field ration. A simple, dense nutrient bar, sealed in a plain wrapper. Human food. I placed it on the ground between us, a small, insignificant rectangle against the monumental scale of the ruin. Then, I stood. I took 2 heavy steps back, turned, and walked away. On my comms, Vance was sputtering. "Kintsugi. What is your action? You have contaminated the specimen. You have broken protocol. Report." I silenced the channel. I had just thrown the mission parameters, my career, possibly interstellar law, into a shredder. For a nutrient bar and a promise. I felt a terrifying, exhilarating fragility. The armor of procedure was gone. I was exposed. And I had never felt more human. Part 2, the transaction and the terms. The following diurnal cycle was a torment of official reprimands and technical debriefs. Dr. Vance was apoplectic. The Steadfast's captain was a glacier of disapproval. I was confined to quarters, my Mech impounded for behavioral contamination analysis. My actions were logged as a grievous breach of first contact non-intervention directives, with a high probability of having irreparably altered the developmental trajectory of a surviving native sentient. I accepted it all. The weak, careerist part of me was indeed destroyed. I felt a strange peace beneath the storm. I had made a promise. Not as the GSV Steadfast, not as a representative of humanity, but as one being to another. The promise was the gold in the break. On the second cycle, as I stared at the ceiling of my quarters, a priority alert chimed. It was from the external sensor net at the transit hub. Motion. The signature of the juvenile, stronger now, and it was not alone. It had returned, and it had brought someone. I was reinstated to the Mech on a tight, observational leash. Do not interact. Observe and record. This is your only chance to salvage this operation, pilot. The captain's voice was cold. When I re-entered the neural link and M77 systems hummed to life, the world felt different. The Mech was no longer just a tool, it was now an instrument of a promise. I moved back to the plaza, my steps monitored by the ship's overwatch. The child was there. Less hunched. The nutrient bar was gone. Beside it stood an adult of its species, taller, more withered, its antennae broken, one eye milky. A parent? A guardian? It held the child's hand, its posture a mix of defiant protection and profound, trembling fear. In its other hand, it clutched a small, tarnished metal box. I stopped at the edge of the plaza. I crouched again, a league away, making myself smaller. The adult gently pushed the child forward. The little one took a few hesitant steps, then placed a small object on a broken plinth, a piece of the nutrient bar wrapper, meticulously folded. Then, it pointed a thin finger at the words I had carved, "I promise to pay later." Then, the adult spoke. Its voice was a reedy, clicking warble, picked up and amplified by the Mech's sensitive audio. Our translation software, still crude, struggled, then produced a text overlay on my visual display. Young one, plus, life gift, equals, debt. We, plus, have, plus, no, plus, food gift. We, plus, have, plus, this. Is, plus, it, plus, enough? The adult then opened the metal box. Inside, resting on frayed velvet, was not a jewel, not a weapon, not a piece of lost technology. It was a set of tools. Fine, precise, exquisitely crafted calligraphic pans and engraving styli, made of a weathered, noble metal. The last artifact of a culture that had valued beauty and record. Their offering was not currency. It was the means to make a record. To write a contract. To seal a promise. My breath caught. They weren't just asking for more food. They were attempting to formalize the transaction. To understand the terms of this incomprehensible generosity from a metal god. They were offering the only thing of true, enduring value they had left, their legacy of craft, in exchange for survival. Protocol screamed in my ear. The captain's voice was sharp. Kintsugi, do not reciprocate. This is spiraling. Acknowledge. I looked at the tools. I looked at the adult's desperate, hopeful face, and the child's wide, watching eyes. To destroy the weak self was a continuous act. It wasn't a one-time event. The weak self now was the one that would refuse this sacred, devastating offer of dignity. I moved. Ignoring the captain's order, I strode forward, not to the plinth, but to the wall opposite my first message. Again, I extended my finger. But, this time, I did not write in Galactic Common. I mimicked the flowing, elegant script of their own dead language, which I had studied in the ship's archives. I carved with painstaking care, the mech's finger moving with the delicacy of one of those very styli. The translation software rendered it in real time for the steadfast, and I spoke the words aloud through the vocalizer, shaping the sounds as best I could. Your gift, plus, is, plus, worthy. Debt, plus, is, plus, paid. This, plus, is, plus, a new, plus, promise. I then pointed from them to the mech, and then to the sky, where the steadfast hung invisible in the gloom. We, plus, will bring, plus, food. You, plus, will teach, plus, your words. Your story, plus, will not end. I then opened the mech's primary cargo compartment, which was supposed to carry mineral samples. I began unloading every non-essential field ration, water purifier, and emergency nutrient pack I had. A small mountain of human sustenance formed before them. A king's ransom in this hungry place. The adult alien stared at the words, then at the food, then back at the mech. It slowly, reverently, closed the box of tools. Then, it did something that shattered me. It bowed, not in submission, but in formal acknowledgement. A dignitary accepting the terms of a treaty. The child mimicked the gesture. Then, it reached out, and, with a trembling finger, touched the first word I had carved for them. Promise. The captain's channel was a roar of static, then, silence. I had just committed the ship, and, by extension, humanity, to an open-ended humanitarian and cultural mission. I had rewritten first contact from an observation into a covenant. As I stood to leave, the adult alien made a soft, complex series of clicks. The translation appeared, Metal One, plus, who sees? What, plus, is, plus, your name word? I paused. I rotated the mech's torso slightly, allowing the external lights to wash over the faded stencil on my chassis, Kintsugi. I pointed to the gold filler in the ceramic repair kits in another open compartment. I pointed to the cracks in the plaza floor. I pointed to them, the survivors, the broken remainders of a world. Then, I pointed back to my name. The adult alien looked. Its functional eye seemed to moisten. It understood. It was not a name of power. It was a name of repair. Of finding value in the break. It spoke one last word. The translator searched, found the closest analog, artisan. I turned and walked back to the extraction point, the eyes of two saved beings on my back. The storm from my superiors would be biblical. My career was ashes. But, as the weak self, the obedient soldier, the detached scientist, crumbled away, something else, something unbreakable, stood in its place. I had forged a bond not of power, but of promise. And, in that, I felt a strength no external force could ever dismantle. Part 3, The Gilded Legacy. The fallout was immediate and severe. I was court-martialed in absentia aboard the Steadfast. The charges were a litany of interstellar violations, unauthorized cultural intervention, material contamination of a pre-contact society, reckless endangerment of a survey mission, and insurrection. The prosecution, led by a stern Jovian Commodore, painted me as a rogue element, a sentimental fool who had risked galactic stability for a feel-good moment. My defense was not a denial. It was an affirmation. I stood not as Pilot Eris Thorne, but as the proxy for the act itself. I displayed the sensor logs, the child's biometrics before and after the ration. The life signs, spiking from near terminal to stable. I showed the recording of the adult alien's offering, the box of tools. I played the audio of its question, "Is it enough?" This was not intervention, I said, my voice steady in the cold, sterile chamber. It was recognition. They initiated a formal exchange based on perceived debt. They offered an artifact of their cultural apex for a commodity of survival. By galactic law, Title 18, Section 3, regarding voluntary transaction with post-collapse sentience, this constitutes a legitimate, if unprecedented, first-contact trade agreement. I merely honored its terms and proposed its expansion. The Commodore scoffed. A trade agreement? With a child and a savage? With the last scribes of Gamma 7, I corrected. Their offering was not a trinket. It was the literal instruments of their historical consciousness. They were trading their past for a future. To refuse would have been an act of cultural annihilation far greater than any contamination. The deliberation lasted hours. During it, something happened. The Steadfast's long-range monitors picked up signals from the planet's surface. Not radio. Light. From the transit hub plaza, using reflected sunlight off polished metal sheets, a crude but effective heliograph. A message, in the same script I had carved. It was translated by a visibly moved linguistics officer. It read, to the artisan of repair. The first lesson. Our word for promise is coral. It means a bond that outlasts the stone. We await your return. The message was repeated. It was a beacon. A request. It was also proof. Proof of sentient, intentional communication initiated by them. Proof that the contact was now bidirectional and consensual. My legal argument was upheld on a technicality, but my military career was forfeit. I was dishonorably discharged. Yet, as the verdict was read, I felt no loss. The weak self that clung to that identity was already gone. But the story did not end. The incident became a quiet scandal, then, a growing legend within the HFY, humanity, fuck yeah, underground net. Stories of humanity's peculiar, often illogical, but profound acts of empathy in a cold cosmos. My actions, the promise of Gamma 7, were dissected, celebrated, and debated. More importantly, it triggered a paradigm shift. A faction within the Galactic Senate, long arguing for a more proactive, compassionate approach to post-collapse worlds, used the incident as a test case. The Kintsugi Protocol was drafted, a framework for limited, culturally responsive aid initiated by clear, consensual signals from surviving sentients. It was controversial, but it existed. The broken world of Gamma 7 was reclassified from a sterilized archive to a protectorate under observation. And I was offered a new role. Not as a soldier, but as a civilian liaison. The sole human authorized to return. When my shuttle touched down in the plaza a standard year later, I came not in a mech, but in simple envirogear. The food stores from the Steadfast had been delivered by drone for months. The two aliens, I learned their names were ESK and his child, Tael, were no longer starving. They were frail, but alive. With them were 17 others, survivors who had crept from the ruins, drawn by the legend of the metal one who keeps promises. They had set up a camp around the carved words, which they now treated as a sacred text. ESK approached, the box of tools in his hands. He opened it and offered me the finest stylus. Artisan, he clicked. The bond outlasts the stone. Teach us the words to tell our story before the stone of our world crumbles. We will teach you the words we have carved on our hearts. And so, we began. I taught them galactic common, not to overwrite their own, but to give their story a voice the wider galaxy could hear. They taught me their language, their history, their poetry, the memories not stored in data crystals, but in oral tradition and the graceful lines of their script. With the tools from the box, and with supplies I brought, they began to write. They transcribed their epic poems onto synth parchment. They drew the faces of their lost billions. They mapped their fallen cities from memory. Tael, the once starving child, became my shadow. His favorite activity was to sit by the massive, crouched form of M77, which I had been permitted to retain as a personal transport, and trace the letters of its name with his finger. He called it the Vessel of Corral. One evening, as Gamma 7's twin moons cast silver light over the plaza, ESK found me looking at the original carving. I promised to pay later. You paid the debt that first night, artisan, he said softly. But you are still paying. Why? I thought of my grandfather's words, now fully understood. Because the self that would have stopped paying was a weak self, I said, the translator conveying the concepts as best it could. That self is gone. What remains cannot be destroyed by duty, or law, or fear. It can only fulfill the promise. ESK was silent for a long time. Then, he took his stylus and, on a clean piece of slate, he wrote 2 lines in his beautiful script. He handed it to me. Beneath it, he wrote the translation. The shell of indifference, shattered, reveals the core. The gilded fracture, that is the seat of the soul. It was their own, ancient aphorism. A perfect echo across the stars. The work continues. More survivors trickle in. A small, resilient community grows around the Plaza of the Promise. They are not being given a handout, they are participating in an exchange. Their cultural memory for continued aid. They are regaining agency, not just sustenance. I still pilot M77, the Kintsugi, to help clear ruins and construct shelters. But its primary function now is as a symbol. A symbol that something can be broken and yet be made more valuable for having been repaired. That a promise from a stranger can be the gold that binds a world back together. The Galactic Senate monitors us, wary but allowing. The HFY net tells our story as one of humanity's finest hours. But, here, on the ground, it is simpler. It is just a man who destroyed the weak thing inside him that said look away, and, in doing so, became unbreakable. It is a mech that became an avatar of a bond. It is a hungry child who is now a scribe. It is a promise, carved in stone, being fulfilled, word by word, day by day. A bond that outlasts the stone. A story that refused to end. Log ends, final annotation. The Kintsugi protocol has since been enacted on 7 other post-collapse worlds. The Gamma 7 enclave thrives. Tael is the first of his species to apply for off-world academic exchange. Pilot Eris Thorn, Rhett, remains as planetary liaison. The artifact, the box of writing tools, resides in the Galactic Museum of Sentient History. The display is titled, The Price of a Promise, How Dignity Bought Survival. The first carved wall has been designated a Galactic Heritage Site. The story continues.